Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make my cherry strawberry jam. Gluten-free, of course, but also sugar-free. I'll be using honey today. So I'm waiting to see how much fruit I get before I determine how much honey I'll put in. And then I've got some lemons and an orange over here. I've got all of my jars and canning stuff ready to go. I do have my jelly jars in this big pot with water, and it's on low. And then of course my stock pot over here. And this right here, if you've never seen one of these before, it is the handiest thing to have, especially if you have a lot of cherries that you need to pit. Of course, if they're really big cherries, they won't fit in the little funnel here. But some of my cherries are kind of small. So I think I should be able to do at least half of my cherries in there and pit them really fast. And then for the bigger cherries, I do have a little handheld cherry pitter. Although if you don't have either of these, you could just use a knife and split them apart. I also have some gloves because if you've ever pitted a lot of cherries, you will stain your hands red. And then I do have some strawberries that were from my garden last year that I had frozen and kind of forgot about them. And I found them recently in my freezer. So I thought those would be really good. And then I've got some other strawberries here. I'll definitely have more cherries as opposed to strawberries, but that's fine. Most of my cherries have little stems here. So I'm going to start stemming my cherries and just throwing the small ones just in the little base here of my cherry pitter. And everything is washed and ready to go. And that's about all the cherries I can fit in there. And this is kind of loud, but all you have to do is just start pushing down the plunger. And I put all of my stems in here. Don't put your stems in the bowl that will be catching your cherries. For some reason, it's been a long time since I've used this, and I thought the cherries went in the container, but they shoot out here. The pits go in here. So put your stems right there. Just take the cherry, put it in the funnel. And then I think you can see that all the pits go in this container. And cherry juice does stain, so be careful of that. And it leaves your cherries mostly whole. This works best if you have a lot of pie cherries. And if you think you might have missed one, like that one right there, I did. Always keep a dish rag handy because the juice will get everywhere and leave little pink spots all over everything. So now that I've got all of my small cherries, now I'm getting into my bigger cherries, and I don't think they'll fit. Oh, maybe they will. They do fit. That's pretty handy. So now that my little bowl is getting full, let's see here. That's probably about 1 cup of strawberries there. And then I'm actually going to put my gloves on and show you how this other little cherry pitter works. And it's not a bad idea to kind of go through and squish your cherries. Just make sure no pits are left in there. I'll get a couple of cherries and show you how my other cherry pitter works. Either one really comes in handy to have. This is one of those appliances that it wasn't super expensive. In fact, I don't even remember how long ago it was. It was probably 6 or 7 years ago I bought this, and I don't remember how much it was. But that year I had about 6 gallons of pie cherries that needed to be pitted, and this made fast work of that job. So this little cherry pitter is just a little handheld thing, and you just go straight in and out the other side. So I usually go through the stem end, and then I try and aim to push it through between my 2 fingers here. That's just how I do it. Then it can kind of shoot out, and it's right there. So either way works really good, and either way is really messy, and you'll get cherry juice all over everything. So I had said that my cherries didn't fit in this machine, and now I remember, now that I'm using it, that they do fit in the machine, but they just don't pop the pits out. So I went through all of my cherries that I had already pitted, And I actually had quite a few that still had the pits in them. So this machine is really good for small cherries, but not so good for really big cherries. But it actually worked out all right because I was able to kind of split apart my cherries, which I was going to mash them anyways with my potato masher. So now they've got a head start. But as you can see, this little handheld cherry pitter goes really fast too. And I don't know if you're like me, but I try and clean as I go, but it just makes a mess all over everything. So you might as well just make the whole mess and clean up when you're done. And I'm not worried about cutting up my strawberries into small pieces because I'm going to mash all of it with my potato masher once it starts cooking and breaking down. But you could, if you wanted to, chop them all up or even put them in a blender or a food processor and get them into fine pieces. But I kind of like it chunky. So I've ended up with 12 cups of cherries and 6 cups of strawberries. And the recipe that I'm following is actually from this book. It's an old canning book from 1977 that was my mom's. And actually, I think it's not 1977, maybe even 1980. But at any rate, this is where I got my recipe for my peach and plum jam that I made last year, and now today's strawberry cherry jam. There's actually a rhubarb pineapple jam that I'm going to make next year when my rhubarb comes on. So the recipe calls for 3 cups of strawberries and 3 cups of cherries to determine our sugar amount, which would be about 4.5 cups of sugar. So I've got a lot more than that. So I'm going to go about 4 cups of honey to equal less than half of the sugar. When you're replacing sugar with honey, usually I cut it in half. So if a recipe calls for 1 cup of sugar, I'll use about 1/2 cup of honey. You can get away with about 3/4 of a cup of honey, but depending on what you're making, it will sometimes change your texture and it will give you a stronger honey flavor. When you're making a jam or something like this with honey, I usually go a little bit less than half. So for the amount of fruit that I have, it would be close to about 9 or 10 cups of sugar. So I'm just going with about 4 cups of honey. So that's actually about 3.5 cups of honey, which sounds good to me. And then we also need, it actually calls for the whole orange. I'm not going to use the whole orange, but I am going to use orange juice and lemon juice. So I'm actually just going to wing it and use both of these lemons and my orange and juice it. And that will be my juice. And you could put the peel in, and then it would kind of like a marmalade-ish. I'm not going to do that today, but you could if you wanted to. And I'm just using a strainer in case there's any seeds. And that's about 1/2 cup of lemon juice and orange juice. Now we just need to pour in our honey. And then I'm going to turn this on probably about medium high. And if you can see back here, I've got my lids in a little saucepan. So now I'm just going to give this a really good stir. It'll be a little easier to stir once the fruit starts breaking down. And once these strawberries soften up enough, I can start using my potato masher and get them mashed up too. Turn your heat down to about medium once it starts to boil, just so it doesn't boil over. I think my pot is too full. Get this back cooking. So once some of that liquid boils down, I'll add this back in and then cook it all till it's really thick. I've got all of my other things ready. So I've got my lids here, I've got my ladle, jar lifter, my lid lifter, hot pads, other hot pads, my funnel, and then a towel. And this is on low. And it's not boiling yet, but I will turn this up just a little bit higher. My jars are in there getting sterilized. And you don't have to stir this constantly right now because it is really liquidy. Once it gets a lot thicker, you'll want to stir it constantly. There. Now my pan is not going to boil over and make the biggest mess ever. But my strawberries are soft enough that I can just mash them against the side of the pan. I'm going to turn that back down to low because I don't want that to rapidly boil before I'm ready for it. And then this can just sit here till I'm ready. And I didn't mention yet, but I'm not using pectin. The recipe actually doesn't call for pectin, which I really like. I don't really like using pectin very much. So it didn't take very long for that to boil down. I think I can safely pour in the rest of my jam. It's looking really good too. I don't have a bigger stock pot than that one. That one I think is an 8-quart. So if you're gonna make this recipe and double or triple it, make sure it won't boil over. But this is okay. And I think I'm gonna have more than what I have jars ready for. So I do have some of these jars. These are the Ball Canning brand freezer jam jars. And they're glass, and then they just come with a little plastic lid. I don't even remember where I got these, but these come in really handy, and then we can just use these ones for freezer jam. And I know there are some jam recipes that call for skimming the foam off. This recipe doesn't call for it, so I'm not skimming the foam off. And most of my fruit is pretty crushed up. I've turned my heat down to low, even though it's still rapidly boiling, just so it doesn't splatter so much. And it is getting nice and thick, but I want it to be a little bit thicker. Since this is almost where I want it to be, I'm going to turn my lids on just to get them heating up. And I am going to turn up my big pot of water here. I want this to be boiling, so when I take the jars out and then put them back in, it won't take so long to come back up to boiling. Don't forget your dish rag. And now that this has been boiling, I'm going to turn it back down again. I know it sounds kind of funny to keep turning it up and down, but I don't want it rapidly boiling when I'm getting the jars out. So turn off the heat for this. And my lids are just barely at a simmer. I actually want to bring that over here. Bring everything closer. And then very carefully, this bubbles and will burn you. This will burn you. Give it a good stir here. We'll go to about 1/4 inch from the top. And then I get out a second jar here. Use the dish rag. Clean off the rim. Be careful, it's hot. Get your lid. Get your ring. And then I just go finger tight. And then we'll go right back into the water. I'll get my other next jar ready. Making a mess all over everything. And I could probably fill this one up a little bit more, but that's all right. Sure looks pretty in the jar. And it's interesting, I was asking my grandma Because the way my mom used to make her jam was she would just fill up her jars, put the lids on, and then flip them upside down, which I've done a lot of jams that way before. And I was asking my grandma, and she does her jam the same way. But in this recipe book that I showed you, it calls for a 10-minute water bath. But I have noticed too in some older cookbooks that I have, they call for just flipping your jars upside down. But because this recipe calls for a water bath, that's what I'm doing. Although I think you'd be okay not doing a water bath. But I actually find it really convenient doing the water bath. It's a really good way to sterilize your jars. You already have a big pot of water going anyways. And maybe you've never made jam before. The whole reason for cleaning the rim off is so you really get a good seal when you put your lid on. And this is the last of my sterilized jars. And these are cute little 4-ounce jars. So now that all of my jars are in my pot, I'm going to turn it back up to high, get it boiling, and then once it's boiling, I'll go for 10 minutes. And then I'm going to fill up my little freezer jars here. You could put these in pint jars if you want to. I like to have more variety, so I always like to do the jelly jars instead of pint jars. That way you don't have to eat a whole pint of this kind of jelly or jam. This is jam. But depending on the size of your family and how fast you go through it, use whatever jar size you like. So it's been 10 minutes. Very carefully. It's already starting to seal. Okay, sure is a pretty color. Once these all cool off to room temperature and they all are sealed, I will wipe them off. I don't know about where you live, but when I do a water bath, it leaves a film behind on the jars and the lids. And so I always wipe them off with a wet cloth just so that mineral deposit or whatever it is comes off, and then they look nice. And then I'll write on the lid what it is and the date. So a single batch, which I'll put in the description box, but I'll also put how much I used today. But that worked out really good. I got 12 8-ounce jelly jars and then 3 4-ounce jelly jars, and then this little bowl, which I think is about a heaping cup, is the size of this bowl. And just the time that it's been sitting here, it is thickening up as well. And if you wanted it to be a little bit thicker, you could cook it a little bit longer and it would thicken up even more. But if you ever notice that you have some jam or jelly that isn't very thick and it's too runny, just use it like syrup. In fact, this would be really good on pancakes. I have a cheesecake recipe here on my channel where I make strawberry syrup. This would be really good on that cheesecake. I also have a no-bake cheesecake here on my channel. This would be really good on. And I also have biscuits. I think this would be really good on my biscuits. But this is cooled off enough, I'm going to taste it. Such a pretty color. That is really good. It's the perfect combination of cherries and strawberries. And I think the orange is coming through just a little bit, and the lemon, it just kind of brightens it up a little bit. But so good. And actually really sweet. I was worried that it would be a little bit on the tart side because cherries are kind of tart, but that is the perfect amount of sweet. And those ones are thickening up a little bit too. Jam is such a great way to use things that are in season. It's also a really great gift idea. It's what I love about recipes like this. You could make these whenever fruit's in season and then give them away as Christmas gifts or any kind of gift. But this worked out so well, so delicious. Let me know what you think if you make this recipe. But thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one.